Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new Record Club episode of the Jams Tea podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And each week, we pick a record to talk about where we all listen to it and then review it. And this week, we're talking about an album that recently just had a big birthday anniversary. We're talking about the project, the Magnolia Electric Company, from acclaimed Americana, alt Americana musician Jason Molina.
Yeah, this is a big album and it's a momentous anniversary as well. I mean, all anniversaries are, it's constructed artifice, the significance, it's all arbitrary. But what really makes this feel particularly poignant as well is that Jason Molina passed away 10 years ago. Like within 2 weeks of this album celebrating its 10th anniversary was when he died. And now, so we're both celebrating, we're both not celebrating, but we're both commemorating the 20th anniversary of this record and also the 10th anniversary of the day that Molina passed in mid-March 2013. He is one of the great Americana musicians of the modern era. I mean, an artist who had a profound influence on me as a teenager, an artist whose music and philosophy and style has filtered through into basically every corner of modern indie rock and folk rock. You talk to any artist, and I mean any artist who's working in the indie rock and folk rock realm and has put out music in the last 10 years, and they will cite Jason Molina as an influence. His work and the power of that work, both the emotional power of that work and the sheer musical flooring nature of its intimacy and its directness, is something that is so immediately attractive and haunting and absolutely captivating. And this is a significant album for Jason. I mean, it represents the culmination of his Songs Ohio project, which is his first solo project, essentially, that comprises the majority of the records that he released in the 90s, solo records such as The Lioness and Ghost Tropic, and the incredible Didn't It Rain, which is probably my favorite slowcore album, one of my favorite Americana albums, the direct predecessor to this record. But this record marked a special moment for Jason in the arc of his career as well, because those records that preceded it, very gothic, very dark, very still, and very minimalist, and very much just these showcases for a kind of poetic address from Jason to the listener. And his style as a lyricist and as a writer is still very much building off of what you hear on those records, but this is an album that has a much fuller band sound. This is an album that sees Jason bringing into the fold a number of external musicians to create something that has a lot more color, a lot more vibrancy, a lot more life, a lot more density than anything he had ever made before, and anything that he would make since. And he dubbed this the Magnolia Electric Company, which then became the name of the project that he would release his subsequent records under. It's unclear whether this is the final Songs Ohio album or the first Magnolia Electric Company album. Jason said in an interview in 2006 that he considered Didn't It Rain to be the final Songs Ohio album. So this very much does feel like a new beginning for Jason, but it also has all of the hallmarks of a tumultuous ending as well. It is a heavy record to listen to emotionally, and it shows a refinement of Jason's writing style to the point where basically every lyric on this record, whenever I listen to it, hearing Jason sing, and he's not the only person who sings on this record, but hearing him in particular sing, each line he delivers is a seared barb that just rips into my soul and stays in there. There's no way we can talk about this album without talking about Farewell Transmission, the very first song on this record, arguably Jason's most famous and beloved song. And certainly, it's the kind of song that I think even Jason himself knew as it was being recorded, that this song was essentially his epitaph. He described it as one of the most heroic recording moments of all time. And it represents hearing the story of how this song was created. It boggles the mind. Jason wrote the chords down. He brought the musicians into the room to play the song. None of them, the song was not written with anyone else. It was not rehearsed with anyone else. Jason had the chords and he had the lyrics, and he brought his musicians into the studio, about 12 people in one room. He showed them the chords and he said, let's just do this and see how it goes. And the very first take of this basically improvised song based around a single chord progression is what you hear on this album. It is not planned in any more detail and is not overdubbed or, redrawn any further than that, to the point where at the end of the song, that just haunting and just chilling moment when Jason is intoning listen over and over again. He is literally trying to clue his band into the fact that this is the part of the song where he wants them to just stop so it can end. And it is an incredible energy contained within this. I don't just mean in the sound of the instruments or whatever, or in the tempo or the pace or whatever. I mean, there is an electricity, a kind of spiritual energy coursing through this. There is a communion clearly between Jason and the musicians who are playing with him on this song, as he is essentially, basically intoning about death and painting this vivid image of a town falling into darkness, of the landscape being overwhelmed by the pitch black sky, the moon itself being destroyed and hung within the jaws of midnight. It is an arresting song, to say the least.
This song was on my radar for even before I had heard the album, just because you had put this down in a really long Twitter thread as one of your favorite album openers of all time. And I remember hearing it, and it's just like immediately that live band sound is what leaps out to me. That's just all across this album, that feels like that perfect meeting point between that kind of lively freestyle improvisation and also the meeting point of that sensibility and a bunch of seasoned musicians who are working together with a synergy that can't be replicated. It's not about whether or not they're good or proficient. It's about whether or not they're singular, whether or not they're locked in, whether or not they just know what they're doing. And here I think they undeniably are. Everything about this song is highly memorable, from its like opening slide guitar instrumental hook that like that's something that's just imprinted onto me ever since I heard this song. But I mean, I guess it's kind of a cliche to hone in on an artist like Jason Molina and like talk about his lyrics, just because they do feel kind of like the lifeblood of this album in many respects. But I have such an unending fascination with the way he writes, and the way he writes about a concept like death on this song, and specifically how it pertains to the themes of the album. Because to me, this is an album that is constantly fighting itself thematically. It's constantly trying to reckon with the idea of wanting to move on from a difficult point in your past, or to heal from a personal shortcoming or failure, and also kind of embracing the inevitability of future failure. And here it feels like that very intimate, very human struggle is blown up to be as big as it possibly can be, so that death becomes not just this thing that creates anxiety in like the main character or in Jason, but as this overwhelming, looming, ominous force that's going to affect this land, this group of people that he's singing about. And the way he communicates these ideas is totally slanted in a way that is both immediate, and that you can appreciate the density of his lyricism, but there's never anything that really kept me at arm's length from this. But it's all written in such a way that totally eschews the very traditionally confessional styles of a lot of folk and alt Americana that you might be traditionally associated with this. Like, this to me is like Jason Isbell by way of Phil Elverum. Which is funny because I would also describe his vocal presence exactly like that as well. That feels like the meeting point between those two kind of sonic signifiers of those artists. But I love how he talks about like the way he refers to everyone. Now we'll all be brothers of the fossil fire of the sun. Now we'll all be sisters of the fossil blood of the moon. And just the way he's able to sort of tie in the idea of these working class people who are bound by these constrictive earthy ideas like fossils or oil or blood, and tying them to the inevitable downfall of death. And then there's the line that I think about from this album the most often, which is, I will try and know whatever I try. I will be gone, but not forever. That second part specifically, I will be gone, but not forever. It's like a roundabout way, a metaphor that's kind of reverse built into itself, that's saying, like, acknowledging how long Jason will not exist within the scope of the universe, but that scope is not forever. That's like there is a singular light contained in time of which he will be alive, which everyone will be alive. And like that's a really hopeful sentiment to bury in such a despondent song. But I feel like that's kind of the key to the record, is that it's not about the overwhelming darkness or the scarcity of the light, but the balance of both of these things that are constantly fighting one another.
Yeah, I like that. I definitely think I don't find it to be despondent at all. It is, there's the way I think Jason characterizes death as well is kind of like this grand purifier, this sort of ultimate destination that unites humanity essentially and unites all living organisms. And it's not so much this sort of destination that we're all sort of careening towards as this ultimate kind of curtain that exists in the periphery and that serves as a backdrop to all of our actions, to all of our feelings, to all of our the things that we do and the ways that we choose to live our life. And that backdrop remains unified across people and across nature as well. There are a lot of references to animals. There are a lot of references to forces of nature or things in nature. A lot of metaphors that use natural and nature-related imagery. Of course,
Very Phil Elverum.
there's the the very stark owl on the front cover of the album as well, really kind of emphasizing that a vivid bird that is associated with darkness as well. It's interesting. I've listened to this album 3 times today just because I wanted to, and just because I was just so engrossed within its world that I didn't feel like I wanted to leave it. And I wanted to be within that world coming right into recording this so that I didn't have to, refine that place. I could just come straight from it. And as I was listening to it this morning, I started thinking about Jason's lyrical style, and I kind of started thinking about a lot of the motifs on this album. And there are a lot of them. Like there are lyrical motifs that Jason will revisit across multiple songs on the record as well. I mean, basically, again, Jason uses a lot of this nature-related imagery to kind of situate us, to kind of provide a space and a backdrop and give a context to humanity and human struggles. But he also uses a lot of imperative language on this album, like a lot of really strong verbs that he emphasizes, things that he will do, things that you should do, things that are done or are in the process of doing. And the verb that he says the most on this album is by far the word try.
Yes.
He says it on basically, I think, almost every song. And again, I know he doesn't sing it on every song, but basically almost every song incorporates the idea of the attempt or of the trying or of the struggle in some way into the lyrical form. And I like that the word try has this kind of, not an ambiguity, but kind of a, there's neither a sense of positivity inherent to it nor negativity inherent
There's
to
a
it.
liminality to it inherently, I think, that's very alluring from somebody who's using a lot of that muscular language that you're talking about, because the word try itself is it very much is in line with that, but its meaning is totally opposed to all of those other things. So it feels like it's really emphasized whenever it comes up.
Yeah, absolutely. And he, likes to do a lot of he uses repetition, or he uses kind of motifs to really emphasize these core imperative things. Like he talks about trying, he talks about attempting to make a change. He talks about, there's a moment on Just Be Simple again where that title of that song becomes in itself just this simple refrain. He goes try and try and try and try to be simple again, just be simple again. This ultimate attempt to kind of distill, or not distill, but like kind of tear away all of the intricacy and complexity of the specific situations, or the places, or the things that these characters or the people and the songs are situated in, and just boil it down to this very simple imperative. And I say the characters in these songs, but really, like, what's interesting about this is that it's very much an album that's mostly sung in the first and second person. There's I and there's you, and Jason is either talking about himself, or he is personalizing himself through some way and relating himself to some other you. I mean, there's third person language as well. There's unspoken and unnamed he's and she's and all that sort of thing as well. But there's very much this sense of direct conversation or direct interaction between one person and another throughout these songs. And for a record that has this kind of cosmic, or that views humanity in this kind of cosmic ballet way of this, we're all, millions of us unified by the backdrop of death and the forces of nature that we're bound to. Yet these are songs about Jason himself struggling, trying, attempting, failing, being lonely, having company, holding on, falling, all these kinds of very simple and very stark and often kind of nondescript uses of language. Occasionally he will evoke specific figures or specific ideas or images to emphasize or make these points more strongly, like on John Henry Split My Heart, where he kind of evokes the steel driving African-American folk hero to make a point about how the way he feels inside his inner turmoil feels like he's literally been completely disintegrated by a steel drill, and the explosives poured inside. There's that sense of images and ideas of Gothic Americana and American history that kind of subtly flow through that as well, which give it a kind of a sense of timelessness as well. Like putting aside production style, and it's a very adeptly and beautifully produced by Steve Albini, it feels as though this could come equally from the 50s and 60s versus the 2000s, the 2010s as well. It has a sense of timelessness to it. It just makes it very easy to listen to. It makes it very easy to find yourself inside of it.
I really like that you mentioned that about the track John Henry Split My Heart, because I feel like that sort of feeds into the idea that we were talking about before, because it's both a great way at demonstrating like the dejected nature of how he feels in the fallout of this, but also kind of in a roundabout way implying that the strength of him, the strength of his heart was great enough so that it had to be broken by this paragon of mythic Americana in John Henry. So it's like there is both an implied fragility and an implied strength in a lot of his metaphors that, again, don't completely tie him to that sort of hopelessness that a lot of other Americana artists or just folk artists, or just the way that I feel like other people would handle the themes and ideas on a record like this. And not to go back and like go in sequence or anything, but I can't talk about this album without mentioning it's really hard, just because this is the only Jason Molina album I've heard, and it's difficult to move on from this record, because I feel like we kind of talk about this phenomenon happening in that with a lot of artists we love, it's sort of difficult to get past certain entry point records with them, just because you're so inundated and fascinated by what they present to you from the outset that it's difficult to sort of move past them before you get your fill out of this. And this is something that's so dense, I'm just never really tired of it, because I talked about listening to it last year for the first time. And my favorite song on here right now, anyway, is actually the second song, I've Been Writing with the Ghost. And I feel like this comes like at not only is like a perfect song in and of itself, but it comes after that sort of full band feeling of Farewell Transmission that just sort of fades into the ether. And then this one just sort of comes out of the darkness. It's really stark. It's just his vocals there at the start of this song. And it's really eerie sounding. The way that's sort of like that gentle reverb on his voice, it really conveys the idea of not just like when you listen to music and when you listen to, you know, an artist singing, generally speaking, you just sort of hear their voice. Whereas sometimes albums will convey an idea of like an instrument or a presence within a specific space. And that's what the sort of recording of this album implies to me here, is that it gives it a sense of tangibility. And then immediately the next sonic idea after you're presented with that tangibility of these vocals is these really fucking spooky female vocal harmonies, the sort of and it's like they just sort of sing that sort of wordless melody over and over again, and it's again, it's really chilling from a sonic standpoint. But when you like look at the lyricism here, it does feel like it embodies the sort of idea, the sort of incentive that he has with writing these songs on the record. The, you know, I've been making a change, been busy trying to make a change, been writing with the ghost, the sort of this idea of constantly living with the specter of your previous self, the specter of previous mistakes, the specter of just like the idea of sin and the past and how it's always going to be with you. But as long as you have that reminder, that's also enough to remind you of how far you've come and how you're still not just that. And it's constantly reminding himself of just like being in these liminal states. I'm standing on a crossroad trying to make up my mind. I'm trying to remember how it got so late, why every night pain comes from a different place. Now something's got to change. I put my foot to the floor. There's this, again, this push and pull on this album that's so compelling. And again, that tangibility is really key here, because every word really does feel like Jason's pushing himself in a different direction on every single song.
Absolutely. And what you're saying as well reminds me of what I think is, in my opinion, the most sort of potent or central lyrical segment of the entire album. And it actually comes right after the segment you mentioned in Farewell Transmission, or at least right after that's sung for the first time, which is the part that where Jason sings, "The real truth about it is that no one gets it right. The real truth about it is we're all supposed to try." Like this, and that to me is the most direct embodiment of what he is saying, I think, with the motif of trying, of attempting. That idea is that the try, the attempt, is not about the success. It is about the reason for living, essentially. It is about the reason for pursuing anything. And that is the drive to seek and discover, like the drive to find out, essentially, to try. And that is, you know, it's quite abstract, obviously, and in a lot of ways Jason's commitment to keeping it abstract on this album, like trying, is such a repetitive motif, but it's always stated in an abstract way. There's never any clarification on what is being tried, what the attempt is. It is always just trying as an idea. And the decision to keep that abstract in a lot of ways really underlines and gives emphasis to the power of those words, really not forcing any kind of interpretation on you or making you think about it in any kind of specific way, but just making you think about those words. There's a mantra element to the way that Jason underlines and really emphasizes core lyrical ideas on this album. One of my favorite songs is the fourth track, "Almost Was Good Enough," which has this sort of very doomy and kind of portentous atmosphere and chord progression as well. And it is kind of one of the saddest songs in a lot of ways. Jason reflecting on how much more difficult things seem now, and how much more kind of lost and trapped that he feels, and also kind of how much emptier he feels. even as, there's this really haunting passage where he sings about the seasons beginning and leaning in, like personalizing the seasons, leaning in and whispering to him that nothing's lonely and in pain anymore. And that should feel, comforting, but there's a kind of chilling nature to that. But my favorite part of the song is towards the end, where he kind of gets to emphasize the idea uh, of escaping. And of course, there's no context for what getting out or making it out refers to. Didn't It Rain, the album that precedes this, I mean, a hugely heavy theme of that record is depression, which he speaks about outright on many songs on that record. It is a very jet black, dark album in which depression is personalized, often as both forces of darkness, but also in things like the moon as well, which is another big motif that recurs in a lot of these songs too. But so my interpretation or my context leads me to believe that he's talking about making it out from depression. But there's this beautiful way in which this idea evolves, where he's talking about, did you really believe that everyone makes it out? Almost no one makes it out. No one makes it out. You're talking to one right now. For once, almost was good enough. And that's like one of I love a moment in any song really where the title is given context by the lyrics that precede it, and the moment where it's delivered, you have this complete you just feel this intense, emotional, overwhelming feeling by the delivery of a line that previously, before you'd heard the song, when you just look at the title of it, you don't really have much context for. But this idea that Jason sees himself, again, in an abstract way, because we don't know what he's talking about, but he sees himself in this context as being the almost, as being the rare thing, the thing that gets to escape, the thing that gets to make it out. And so, for as tempting as it can be to read Jason's attitude and Jason's feelings about himself in this incredibly dark and self-loathing light, and I mean, his previous records would, make that interpretation very easy. One of the things that feels so distinct and so powerful about Magnolia Electric Company is that it is an album that acknowledges and confronts and speaks quite eloquently and directly, if through abstract terms, about darkness and about sadness and about crushing, intense depression. But it situates that in a context where it does feel surmountable, where it does feel as though it is something that Jason is overcoming, even if it is only in this present moment where he is doing it through the sheer force of the art that he's creating. And it's the art that he's creating that's pushing him out of that. And that as soon as the art is gone, he'll be gone too. But still, the art is enough to keep him there. I mean, that I think is at the core of some of the most heartrending and beautiful and life-affirming, but also desperately sad lyrics ever written in the closing track, Hold On Magnolia, which, it does feel, even more than Farewell Transmission, like a kind of epitaph. Hold On Magnolia, I mean, especially because, of the obvious similarities between the word, or the Magnolia, and Jason's own surname. There's only one letter of difference between the two. And this is something that's not new as well, because he did this on his previous record as well, where he even addressed himself directly. So it's not a new idea for him. But here, the address and the contents of that address and the sorts of things that he's communicating feel so much more life-affirming, or at least so much more full of potential than they ever have before. Though he does say lines like, I hear that station bell ring and you might be holding the last light I see before the dark finally gets a hold of me. He also says, in my life I've had my doubts, but tonight I think I've worked it out with all of them. He says, I hear that lonesome whistle whine. I think it's almost time. And you feel as though he feels a calamitous ending approaching. But he also acknowledges that no one has to be that strong. No one has to be powerful enough, or be confident enough, or be courageous enough to stare death down, or to overcome it, or to overcome anything that might be standing in your way, that it is okay to simply try, to simply acknowledge and live in the face of all of it.
I think this is further emphasized too by the sort of structure of the album. Right, right after you get to Almost Was Good Enough, which is the song that sort of embodies the more pessimistic kind of outlook you can have, embodying sort of the worldview expressed on here. And then immediately after that, you have two songs that don't feature Jason on vocals, and it's almost like he's so put upon that he can't bring himself to sing the next two songs. And I love the vocal performances on both. Lawrence Peters on the Old Black Hen is like one of the most quintessential country music voices I think I've ever heard. And then afterwards on Peoria Lunchbox News, you have Scout Niblet, who performed, I believe, with people like Bonnie Prince Billy over the years and stuff, who's really, again, really brings a great kind of vocal texture to everything here that adds some variety to this record. And then he comes back on John Henry Split My Heart, which almost feels like a setup for the sort of ending, the sort of grand statement of Hold On Magnolia. And it's really, it just does such a great job at feeling like a complete package. It's everything you could want out of a record like this, and the way it closes just with the notion of finding a kind of simple, solemn beauty in knowing that you don't have to be strong enough to beat the inevitable, and then kind of surrendering yourself to it. It is very sad, but that's the thing here, is that nothing on this album is purely sad or purely optimistic. It almost exclusively deals in ideas that are so multifaceted and so emotionally kind of multi-layered that it just doesn't lend itself to a surface level reading. It doesn't lend itself to an easy out. And you really have to interrogate and prod at what he's saying and what these like songs actually mean within the context of one another. It's such an interwoven, beautiful tapestry of music. It's just astounding to me that anybody could be able to write such an informed treatise on a concept like as dour as death, not just because it's a difficult concept, but because it is an unknowable concept. But then you listen to something like this and it feels like you come close enough. We've tried, and then we can just accept that we don't have to understand it. And that's the beauty, because that's the theme of the record.
Yeah, I want to give a special shout out as well to the Old Black Hen, which is one of my three favorite songs on the album, actually. Lyrically, it has a folkier style to it in terms of the way the song is actually written as well. You have this refrain of the bad luck lullaby as this, this song that represents the kind of blackness, the darkness kind of coming for you all. And there's this idea of transmission of that darkness as well from one generation through down to the next. And it ends with one of my favorite lyrics on the whole record as well. Look down the long street and see who's that crying. Tell them that every day I lived, I was sick trying to sing the blues the way I find them. That's such a crushing but also uplifting idea as well. And it gives you, again, it's maybe one of the only times on the record that, again, it's not Jason singing, but it's Jason writing, where you get an idea of what is being tried. He's trying to sing the blues the way I find him, that Jason sees his whole grand task, like his whole grand mission, as simply being to represent the darkness and be able to put it into a song and be able to put it into a piece of art and be able to make it tangible. And through that transcend his own life and his own limitations. It's one of my favorite moments on the whole album. I want to give a shout out as well to a song that didn't actually make it onto the album proper. You can listen to it on the deluxe edition of the record as well. I think it's the longest song that Jason ever put out. I could be wrong about that though. It's a song called The Big Game Is Every Night. It's 10 minutes long, and it works the thing about this album is that when I listen to it, I often include this song at the end, and it's almost like the album has three closers in a row. Because John Henry Split My Heart kind of ends with this callback to Farewell Transmission, and also this idea of half of my split heart I'm going to use to pay the band who helped me make this record, and half I'm saving because I'm going to owe them. This idea that ultimately, something will come for him eventually, and he'll need to reach out to these people that he has essentially already given half of his heart to. So the record ends with it, although the kind of arc of the album seems to end with John Henry Split My Heart, with that callback and with that declarative statement of acknowledging the band who made the album. And then Hold On Magnolia almost just feels like an epilogue or like a postscript, where Jason is kind of communicating through to the listener in a much more sort of intimate and direct way. And then The Big Game Is Every Night feels kind of like, it's one of Jason's most optimistic songs. It's one of his most densely written songs as well. It uses a lot of dense lyricism that refers to artists and politicians and historical figures, all kind of congregated around this sort of fictional baseball game. But there's a passage in that song where he repeats, honestly, over and over and over again, let the last thing I see be me helping, be me honestly, be me working on being a better me. And you get that sense more clearly through this song than anything on the record, that Jason is, at least at the time of writing these songs, buoyed and empowered by a sense of purpose that he has been craving, or that he has been looking for, or that he's been waiting to animate him. And that the fact that the story of Jason's life ended as tragically as it did, a prolonged illness and ultimate organ failure as a result of his awful struggle with alcoholism for much of his life. Yeah, it's almost a cliche, and it's almost reductive to say that in a work like this, he's created something that transcends that situation, and in a lot of ways writes over that horrible, sad end to his story. And though he released much music after this, and a lot of it is great, much of it is compiled into the excellent compilation album Sojourner that I recommend. This feels like the point that all of the work he made before it was heading towards, and that all of the work he made after it exists in the glow of. It's the central fulcrum point that I think even Jason himself would acknowledge as his masterpiece, as the work that his whole artistic drive led to and culminated in. And yeah, I mean, what more can we say? It's a magnificent record, and it deserves to be celebrated, and it deserves to be remembered, and it deserves to be, not that it isn't already, but it deserves to be fully canonized in the pantheon of great works of art, great American works of art of the 21st century. Let us know at home what this album means to you, what the music of Jason Molina means to you. Let us know what your favorite aspects of this album are. If you have any additional interpretations or comments on the style of the record, on Jason's writing style, on the music itself. We touched on some of the core things, I think, but as ever, we can't talk about everything. So if you have anything you want to add, please chuck it down in the comments below. Or if you just enjoyed the video, let us know. Regardless, we really appreciate it. If you want to go above and beyond and support us directly, you can become a member of the Jams and Tea channel by hitting the join button. And for just $1 a month, you can get your name in the title call of every video on this channel. Plus, if you want to recommend us some music to talk about, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. Until next time, though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago. Avis, we try harder.